Antony Loewenstein, who's a journalist and author of My Israel Question. And Antony, you lived in occupied East Jerusalem for 4 years. And as Joel was saying, this is a complicated picture at the top of the Israeli government within that war cabinet. And as Joel said, a lot of people holding Benjamin Netanyahu ultimately responsible for what happened on October the 7th. Given that, where do you think this resignation that came through in the last hour by the head of military intelligence, how does that affect that pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, it should start at the top. And I say that because if you ask most Israelis, this is based on public opinion polls for months, Netanyahu's very unpopular. That has not changed. If there was an election held tomorrow, almost certainly he would lose. But there's one important caveat to this, and that is that any of the likely successors, Benny Gantz particularly and others, on the key issues, Gaza, potential US sanctions on IDF soldiers, the West Bank, the occupation, all the key issues that are frankly existential questions for Israel, there's very little difference between any of them. And that's because the majority of the Israeli public supports these policies. So they don't like Netanyahu as a person. This was an issue before October 7, but certainly since, because he's rightly blamed for the intelligence military failure on that day. And the fact that 6 months on after the war began, most of the hostages have not been released, and Hamas is obviously still very much alive and kicking in Gaza. So, but the likely replacements aren't that different. So the resignation is important, yes, but many, many more people need to. And frankly, there needs to be a full investigation, which has not happened yet, to determine how so many of the governmental and intelligence forces failed abysmally on October the 7th.
So do you think there will be more resignations to follow then, possibly even today or tomorrow?
Look, obviously today or tomorrow, hard to say, but I think there'll be more resignations. I think if and when there is an investigation into what happened, which I might add Netanyahu is not interested in really having, and it is why many have argued, I think with credibility, that he wants the war to continue, because as soon as the war ends, whatever that means, by the way, the war ending meaning Hamas is defeated or the hostages are returned or they're all discovered to be dead, which I fear may be the case, then the investigation seriously begins, particularly on him and the people around him. And it seems pretty likely that there'll be profound reports finding him in breach. I mean, let's be clear. He spent years literally funding Hamas. I mean, that's not a secret. It's been on the record for a long time. And many Israelis are pretty outraged by that. And the sad reality is, though, that the likely successes, as I said, are very, very similar. But more people will resign, to be sure. But again, resignation's not enough here. I mean, October 7, from the Israeli public perspective, was a catastrophe beyond belief. And resignations are just the beginning. There needs to be actual accountability and potentially actually trials for people.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a difficult question, but where does this all end?
Oh, well, the conflict itself, or just this war?
But either.
Yeah. I mean, look, the war won't last forever. I mean, ultimately, I think what Israel is doing in Gaza seems pretty clear. There'll be some Israeli military presence there for the foreseeable future. There is a real possibility, although it's not certain, there'll be some kind of Israeli settlements there, which would be utterly insane. But there is massive pressure on the Israeli government to establish settlements. In terms of the longer term, the only way this conflict will end, as I've been saying for years, is outside and massive international pressure, sanctions and boycotts. It will not end with the Israeli public suddenly rising up to demand the end to the occupation. It simply won't happen. That constituency does not exist. There are Israelis who oppose what's going on, but it's a tiny minority. So without outside pressure, which I think after the end of this war, arms embargoes and boycotts are conceivable, not from the US or the UK or Europe, but from other nations. And that's how it starts, as it did with South Africa and apartheid many decades ago.
Really good to get your thoughts, Antony. Thank you so much. Antony Loewenstein there, journalist and author of My Israel Question.